Hello there. I hope you're doing really well. It's good to be back. Sorry it took me so long. It's been about 3 weeks. But if you're here, thank you for being here. And if you're new, then allow me to tell you what I've been up to here. My name is Sarah, and I've been reading On the Path, an anthology on the Noble Eightfold Path, drawn from the Pāli Canon. And this book was written by Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu around 2017. And he's an American Buddhist monk, and he is widely respected for his translations of Buddhist texts and his teachings on meditation and the Dhamma. And his works are deeply rooted in the Theravāda Buddhist tradition, emphasizing a direct, practical approach to the Buddhist teachings. And as I always say, thank you so much, sir, for putting this in the Creative Commons so that people like me can do projects like this without having to pay royalties. And thank you so much, sir, for putting this book in general in the Creative Commons, or in other words, it's free. It's a free book. So if you expand the description here, you'll see a link to the book. And I'm pretty excited, actually, even though I'm very late to get in here, because we're starting on a new chapter. We just finished up Right Resolve, which followed Right View. And a considerable portion of the book was devoted to these two quote-unquote rights in the Noble Eightfold, in the Eightfold Path, Right View, Right Resolve. And today, we're getting started with an entirely new section, and we'll find out why Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu chose to put two of the rights together in one chapter. And so we're moving into chapter 5. And so if you are following along in the book, the PDF version like I have, well, hey, while I'm waiting for my book to load here, I definitely also want to warn that I can be very profane sometimes on here. You know, I'll drop F-bombs and S-bombs and other kinds of bombs. It's never done in the service of hatred, ever, ever. But I just wanted to put that out there for you so that you know this is not a family-friendly show. It's certainly not pornographic by any metric, but, you know, I'm profane. I'm a profane gal. So yes, so we are starting at the top of page 279. And as I say, as I mentioned, this is chapter 5, right speech and right action. Right speech and right action are the first two virtue factors on the path. Both are based on the principle of non-affliction, developed through right resolve, in that they involve abstaining from specific types of behavior that cause harm. Because these two path factors parallel each other in many ways, they are best discussed together. The suttas provide general definitions for and a few specific examples of right and wrong speech and action. The Vinaya also contains training rules covering most of the types of behavior that these factors abstain from, which it discusses in great detail. Our discussion here will draw from all these sources. Right speech. Right speech is defined as abstaining from 4 types of wrong speech: lies, divisive tale-bearing, harsh speech, and idle chatter. Lies are statements that intentionally misstate the facts of a case. The Vinaya's discussion of its training rule against lying shows that the intention defining a lie here is not so much the intention to deceive as it is the intention to misrepresent the truth. And then here, Bhikkhu has in parentheses PC1. The distinction is a fine one, but it's important. In Sutta 170, the Buddha states that there are cases where a truth should not be told if it gives rise to passion, aversion, and delusion in the speaker. This does not mean, however, that you can misstate the facts of the case in such instances. It simply means that you need not tell the whole truth about an issue. You avoid speaking about the facts that would provoke harm, even if this would cause your listener to misunderstand the situation. AN 4:73, Sutta 172, provides an example relevant to this principle. To maintain your integrity, you speak as little as possible of your own good points and of the faults of other people. Okay, so if you're new to all of this, then you know that I interject with my peanut gallery constantly, and of course I have to do it right away. And I also want to say, if you're new, that I do use AI. I am not a scholar of Buddhism. I've never been a nun. I've never been ordained. I've been reading this book now for about a year and a half, and I was exposed to Buddhism back in my early 20s and have forgotten so much of the detail, yet at the same time it really has kind of proved to be my compass for so many, couple decades now plus. So I'd love to talk to you a little bit about what Robot had to say about what a Buddha. And this is where you should never look to me as a teacher. And this is where I, for one, in my view, a teacher is so important. And if you've been following along, you know that I've been waiting to get a teacher because I'm trying to move and I just don't want to put down any roots here, blah, blah, blah. I can't wait. I can't wait to get a teacher again. The Buddhist kind of teacher. And, there's an earlier episode or earlier in the book, the Buddha talks about, how he views the role of a teacher and friendship. But at any rate, I want to go off the rails here. I'll just say, hey there, this is the kind of thing you would get from a teacher, and I'm remembering it. But then again, this is AI, so there you go. Do your own research. So earlier in this section, it was talking about these two are the first two of the virtue factors, and they're we just got done with right resolve, and so these right speech, right action, and right livelihood, which we'll be getting to next, I believe. I haven't looked ahead. These are all. This is what Robot calls them, and I think that this is a really great kind of way to put it. Behavioral expressions of right resolve. So we can resolve to practice right speech. We can resolve to avoid practicing wrong speech. We can resolve to take right action. We can resolve to avoid taking wrong action. We can resolve to take on right livelihood. We can resolve to avoid wrong livelihood, which we'll get to later. And I love this here. Again, don't remember this, maybe never learned it. So here, I'll just read the sentence here that Robot says. All three are behavioral expressions of right resolve: nikama, avyapada, avihimsa. So hopefully I did right by that Pāli there. Right speech, right action, right livelihood. And so Robot says these are organized around non-affliction. Ooh, non-affliction. Even thinking about that here for a moment before I even get into my peanut gallery in real proper fashion for me, this is just so true. Because really the reason why I stopped right there is because this is truly the Achilles heel. I would say in my life, in this life, whatever you believe, I struggle, despite my practice, I struggle with impatience. If you've listened to earlier episodes, then I've talked a lot about how I'm a very fiery person, extremely fiery, and full of fight. In terms of how I respond. And this is something that I've spent, as I said, 2 decades plus, using myriad things to help me regulate, co-regulate. And, I don't always get it perfectly well, like for instance, I am very sensorily sensitive. And so the larger the crowd, the louder the noise, the more kind of jacked up I am, kind of just overwhelmed and suddenly heat in my mouth. What do I mean by that? Heat in my mouth. Tone of voice, harsh, snap. There's no judgment here. My understanding, it's more about kind of observing your behavior. Observing it and kind of, all right, I'm doing this, resolving. I did it again. Okay, so recommit. You might have to recommit a gazillion times. Given my age, I probably have recommitted a gazillion times. I make mistakes all the time. I'm not a naturally likable person. I'm kind of a little bit intense. I feel things very deeply. I can't help but to think about things very deeply. It seems to be my natural kind of modus operandi, So at any rate, right speech, avoiding lying, and avoiding, and this one I really loved, because this is another one where I can forget, I've developed habits of mind, habits of speech. The less regulated I am, the more likely I am to engage in these habits of speech. And so when I read this little sentence right here, it really stuck out at me because I could relate to it. So I'll read it again. To maintain your integrity, great word, right? You speak as little as possible of your own good. You speak as little as possible of your own good points and of the faults of other people. This is something that I really, really struggle with, if I'm really, really honest. I think to a certain degree, I'm a little bit hardwired to look for potential threat. And again, go back and listen to other episodes. You can hear about my life, probably more than you'll ever want to know. But I think I was wired for that at a fairly young age, to regulate myself, to feel comfortable, to feel safe. Was a habit, was a mechanism that I developed and employed quite successfully that doesn't really serve me so well now. And so sometimes it can be misdirected in this particular way. Anywho, so I think I'm going to keep it moving on here, because I know I've been talking a lot. But I'll have more to say. Yes, I will. I will have more to say. But I would love to wrap this section up here so that I can speak to it a little bit more fully. So the Buddha is talking about the 4 types of wrong speech. Of the 4 types of wrong speech, the telling of lies is the only one that has a corresponding precept in the 5 lay precepts. This means that it's the only aspect of wrong speech that is absolutely to be avoided in all situations. As AN 10:165 says, one should not tell a lie for one's own sake, for the sake of another, or for any reward. Of the various forms of wrong speech and wrong action, the Buddha regarded the telling of lies as the most serious and most destructive. I did not remember that, and I'm looking forward to exploring that. Perhaps because if you cause your listeners to misunderstand the truth, it can cause them to act unskillfully, not only in this lifetime, but also in future ones as well. Furthermore, as he said in Sutta 169, if a person feels no shame at telling a lie, there is no evil that person will not do. So that's a powerful sentiment. And I think I just want to sit with that idea for a moment. Well, I think what will help me, and I don't know, maybe it'll help you too, I don't know, is to provide a little context for this about, in other words, this is why yes, he's saying why. He finds it to be the most egregious. I think I want to wrap it around a scenario that maybe we all can relate to. I know that will help me to appreciate why Buddha took this so seriously, this particular form of wrong speech, lying, telling a lie for one's own sake, for the sake of another, or for any reward. What I also want to try to square for myself here is what was said in the previous paragraph. The Buddha states that there are cases where a truth should not be told if it gives rise to passion, aversion, and delusion in the speaker. So there's a couple of things there that I know I said I was going to keep on reading, but I really need to resolve for myself here before I continue on. So I will be right back. I'm going to do a little bit of work with the robot that I use. And yeah, as I say, bring back hopefully a relatively juicy scenario to appreciate at a greater depth why. Okay, I'm back. And yeah, robot was super helpful here. And per the usual, I'll read a little bit of what robot said. And so, no, I didn't misunderstand. He is being clear, says robot. So we'll see if you agree that he's being clear. We have a language barrier here, right? Plus it wasn't even written down. There's so much going on here. So lying is always wrong. And that's what Robot says the Buddha is indeed saying here. Lying is always wrong, period. It's wrong. And someone who doesn't feel ashamed when they tell a lie reveals a lot about the character of that person. That's another thing that the Buddha is saying here. So there's that. It can corrupt your own perception, and it can distort somebody else's perception, which could lead them to make choices that could impact their karma. You may or may not believe in the idea of karma or kama. I'm very, very open to it. You know, to me, it's no less likely than there being a heaven or a hell. So, you know, these are grave repercussions here that could come here from the downstream effects of the lie. But he's also saying that we're not automatically obligated to speak the truth in every situation. And this is really the sticking point for me, and Robot agrees. You know, if Buddha is saying lying is wrong, but if it's true and it potentially would be harmful, don't say it. Well, then my first question is, how do I know? And what does that mean exactly? Hurt. This makes me uncomfortable because it's breaking a pattern of his. And so I feel like this is where I really need a teacher. Otherwise, I start to hold him suspect. So I know what I'm thinking can't be right, you know? So again, I can't wait to get a teacher. But I would really like to understand this better. So as I said, I wanted to give you a really good case and study so that maybe, I don't know, maybe it'll help you to understand why I'm confused. Maybe you're confused. Maybe it'll help me to be less confused. I tried to think of some experiences in my own life, and because I'm confused about the distinction here, I didn't trust my own examples. So I asked Robot to help me. So maybe you have a good friend and they think their partner, their mate, is sleeping with someone else and lying about it. And you, the friend who's hearing this, you've seen some suspicious behavior as well. You're not certain about it. You're not sure, but you know, you've seen some things that look suspicious to you. But if you were to say that, yeah, you know, gosh, now that you mention it, I noticed he was talking to so-and-so yesterday. Now you've planted a seed of doubt, of insecurity, of anger, potentially panic. You planted a seed based on nothing, right? Based on what you thought you saw. So when in doubt, check it out, is to me the moral of that story. And that absolutely helps me to understand the Buddha's distinction here. And I think it gets back to that idea of idle chatter. You know, gossiping and idle chatter can get us into all sorts of mischief. And, you know, when you think about it, this scenario that Robot came up with here isn't, to my view, an example of something that could easily segue into idle chatter. That part of us that craves it, the excitement, the drama. Especially if our lives are not as meaningful as we'd like them to be right now. Here's another one. And now I really am going to give it to you exactly the way Robot did. Scenario 2, workplace performance. The manager asks, is John the reason this project failed? You know that John made major mistakes. But so did others. And blaming him alone would damage him unfairly. So here in this scenario, the Buddha would suggest that right speech would not be to lie and say, nah, you know, no. That would be false. He clearly made mistakes. Another thing the Buddha suggests shouldn't be done, misrepresenting it, deflecting it, diverting the conversation. So here the Robot says the timeline was the problem. So kind of deflecting responsibility. So here, Robot's providing this because Robot says this is an example of what the Buddha was describing. Shaping the truth to mislead others. shaping the truth, shaping the framing to knowingly mislead others is not to be done. He says, what is right speech? And here the word is withholding is the word that Robot is using here. And this is the example that Robot gives here of how you could respond to your boss. There were multiple points of failure. I'd rather look at the process than isolate a person. Whoa! Man, isn't that fantastic? I'm absolutely thrilled that we're in this chapter. I can see where my weaknesses are profoundly in reading this section. And just having Robot kind of help me tease this out is very helpful. Very helpful. So we don't lie to protect people. We don't lie to protect ourselves. We also don't tell the entire truth, every minutia, if it's going to cause harm. Reduce, redirect, or stay silent. And I can just think of so many times where that was not how I behaved. You know, where I allowed my anger to get the better of me. And I did not reduce. I did not redirect. I did not stay silent. And again, as I've mentioned before, when I start to notice my behavior, I start to notice this pattern of behavior. You know, there's some aspects of it are things that I'm just struggling with, you know, that are on me and I need to resolve. But I also trust, you know, my intuition. You know, I meditate and I know myself quite well as a result. It's kind of one of those, I don't know, I think it's a benefit. But it's also reminding me, you know, that you know, again, if you're in a position, you know, if you're in a position where you're noticing that something is just bumping up against you constantly, and granted, I realize that I believe there are branches of later Buddhism that really encourage us to, you know, work with that. And that's great. I agree. I think it's a wonderful idea because at the end of the day, you're going to have to work with it. You know, like nobody wants to be living in a war zone, for instance. I mean, it's not like those people get to decide whether they are or are not going to work with it. By the same token, I would disagree with anyone at all, you know, who would suggest to me that not guarding the sense gates is Buddhism. I mean, it isn't, you know, just read the book, man. So, you know, I think that's, I'm not always a fan of the idea of yes and, because sometimes the and is wholly in contradiction with the original yes, in which case there can't be an and. But in this instance, I see where it can get nebulous. I see where I see where I have a lot of work to do. Yeah. All right, I'm going to keep on reading. Okay, so I got a little bit lost in relationship to where we are. So I think I just need to keep on going. Sarah, keep reading. So I'm just going to take it back. I think I'm taking it back a little bit. Top of page 280. This is a principle with far-ranging implications. We're talking about the lying and whether or not we're lying. Even a seemingly sober attempt to justify the telling of a lie in certain situations would count as feeling no shame around lying. In addition to showing that one is untrustworthy, a lack of shame around telling lies would severely hamper one's ability to learn the Dhamma. After all, as we noted in Chapter 2, truthfulness is one of the basic qualities that the Buddha looked for in a student. And it's absolutely necessary for examining one's actions for the sake of progress on the path. Even a seemingly sober attempt to justify the telling of a lie in certain situations would count as feeling no shame around lying. I can definitely relate to that. There's something about lying, and there's something about the subtle activity of the mind that tries to reconcile the lie to avoid cognitive dissonance. It's very attractive. It's very almost second nature, seemingly, to Homo sapien. I think if left untrained, it could be so easy to not feel ashamed of telling a lie. Here's where I just don't know what the Buddha would have to say about that. You know, in earlier readings, earlier sections of the book, way back at the beginning, Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu presented some suttas and some teachings wherein the Buddha was teaching his son. And I've just, I've been thinking a lot about how difficult parenting must be, and how do parents teach their children about right speech? How do they in other words, do they spend time talking about these ideas? And yeah, if you don't, then do you just kind of go through life not really caring whether or not you lied? And then I guess, yeah, it all just kind of degrades from there, doesn't it? As the Buddha warned. So anyway, I'm just going on and on now. Let's get into it. Divisive tale-bearing is the act of telling A about the misbehavior of B so as to win favor with A, or to provoke a rift between A and B. Divisive tale-bearing also covers all sorts of speech intended to promote factionalism between individuals and groups of people. This type of wrong speech is sometimes translated as slander, but that's a mistranslation. Slander is a form of lying. Divisive tale-bearing is not. You simply report the unadorned facts of another person's behavior, and if the intention is to create a rift, it still counts as divisive tale-bearing. The Vinayas discussion of its training rule against divisive tale-bearing shows that the intention is the crucial factor in determining whether the act of reporting A's misbehavior to B would come under the rule of PC3. And by the way, here Ṭhānissaro has PC3 in parentheses, and he did earlier as well. And the PC refers to the Pācittiya. So Pācittiya 1, Pācittiya 3 in this particular instance. And so Pācittiya 3 is the Vinaya rule on divisive speech. So this would be divisive speech, the tale-bearing. In line with the discussion there, it would not count as wrong speech if you tell A about B's misbehavior for other reasons, as when A is responsible for B's behavior and can put a stop to it, or if someone A or C could be hurt by B's behavior. It's for this reason that the Buddha would criticize the teachings of contemporary teachers, although he was careful to mention those teachers by name only when speaking to his monks. When speaking to outsiders, he would criticize opposing teachers, but without mentioning the teachers by name. And so here, he's modeling the behavior. He doesn't want to do harm, but if he perceives wrong speech or wrong view, but notice, he leaves the name out to protect so as not to cause harm. So it's a beautiful way of modeling the behavior that he recommends that we ourselves practice. Harsh speech is speech that is meant to be rough and repellent. AN 10:165 describes it as words that are insolent, cutting, mean, or bitter to others, reviling others, provoking anger, and destroying concentration. The Vinaya focuses on the cutting aspect of harsh speech with a rule against insults, which it defines as remarks based on the desire to jeer or to scoff at someone, or to make that person feel abashed. PC2. In its discussion of that rule, though, it recognizes that there can be times when a teacher or a parent has to use harsh language to get the attention of the person he or she is teaching. For this reason, it states that harsh or even insulting terms do not count as offenses when used for the purpose of conveying the Dhamma. And so this gets into some really interesting waters here, and I would imagine has been profoundly misused, I'm sure, by many. I can see all kinds of holes here that people would be able to find, would be able to take these teachings and transduce them into lining up with whatever their will is. And this is why I think I myself need, first of all, I don't consider myself a teacher. I realize I'm doing this, this book club. And so I guess to some they would put me in the teacher role. I would really caution you not to in this regard with this podcast, because I'm not equipped. I'm not qualified. So don't do that. I'm a lay person. That's it. I'm just a regular guy, and I'm a lay person. Take it very seriously. I'm very earnest. But, how far have monks taken this? Well, I've heard stories that some have taken it quite far. And you all know how I feel about abuse. If you've been following along, you all know how I feel about abuse. If you all have been following along, you all know about my temper. And there's certain aspects of my makeup that are very un-Buddha-like, and that, where I really have to work to feel compelled to even want to bring Buddhism in, because it feels so righteous, so luscious. So, I realize this can be a very, very subtle thing here. How far can one take this? For this reason, it states that harsh or even insulting terms do not count as offenses when used for the purposes of conveying the Dhamma. And I certainly do that in this podcast. I cuss and all the things in the service of the Dhamma. In other words, in the service of how deeply I feel about this practice, how I see the world, I guess, The suttas and the Vinaya in general recognize this principle when they show the Buddha using strong words to criticize wayward students. In MN 22 and MN 38, for instance, 2 monks in his presence attribute pernicious views to him, and in response he calls them worthless men, a term that he also uses to address monks who act in ways that will inspire him to set forth the Vinaya rule. In CV 7 3.1, when Devadatta asks to take over the Sangha, the Buddha calls him a lickspittle. We'll find out what that means later, apparently to warn Devadatta that his desire will lead to his ruin, or to warn the monks in general that Devadatta has embarked on a seriously wrong course and so should not be followed. Interesting. So I will definitely do some research on that and come back and try to, get more into that one, see what's going on there. But I'm going to keep reading for now. At times, the Buddha could also be cutting and satirical in his humor when it served the purpose of the Dhamma. In AN 5:191, for instance, he compares Brahmins with dogs, and the dogs come out on the better end, in that dogs still observe some of the fine aspects of old Brahmanical traditions that many Brahmins have abandoned. And here's a quote from a translation. In the past, Brahmin males mated only with Brahmin females and not with non-Brahmin females. At present, male dogs mate only with female dogs and not with female non-dogs. This is the first ancient Brahmanical tradition that is now observed among dogs, but not among Brahmins. And then there's an ellipses. So he continues, but Ṭhānissaro picks it up here. In the past, Brahmins did not make a stash of wealth, grain, silver, or gold. At present, Brahmins make stashes of wealth, grain, silver, and gold. At present, dogs do not make a stash of wealth, grain, silver, or gold. This is the fourth ancient Brahmanical tradition that is now observed among dogs, but not among Brahmins. So there's a lot going on there, and a lot of years have passed culturally, a lot of separation. So I'm going to go get a little help from Robot. Again, I want to reiterate, I use Robot to help me, so please do not use me as a proper source for studying Buddhism. Okay, but I am going to go and I'm going to wrestle a little bit with Robot to see if I can penetrate this quote. Be right back. So just to put this back into context, this is, Ṭhānissaro is presenting this as an example of how the Buddha might have used very kind of cutting speech to make a point. And so Robot was really helpful. I asked Robot to kind of put this into a modern frame, perhaps, or at least, one that a modern Westerner like myself could understand. And so in this instance, the Buddha's making kind of a rhetorical move. He's saying, hey, this is kind of a direct argument against the caste system in which he came up. And again, if you go back and you look at earlier sections of the book, or just in general, go and do your own research on Siddhartha Gautama's background, where he came from, a member of the warrior class in India 2,600 years ago. He was kind of a radical. And here's what he's saying. He's saying, look, this Brahmanical, elite, you marry outside of your caste system. You have children with people that are outside of your group, your caste. So this claim of purity is BS. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Which one is it? You say you're a pure lineage, but your behavior shows something else. And again, that was a really big departure from my understanding. This was a real sort of Buddhism. It was almost a quiet revolutionary move, a rejection of this idea of caste. So here, he's very straightforward in using this analogy. He's exposing their own inconsistencies with this idea of purity, caste purity. The Buddha's rationale for this sort of speech is stated in Sutta 175, where he notes that he has a sense of time and place for when to use pleasing words and when to use displeasing words. To explain his motivation for using displeasing words, he cites the analogy of a young boy who gets a sharp object in his mouth. You have to do everything you can to remove the object, even if it requires drawing blood. Otherwise, the boy will swallow the object and suffer even greater harm. This analogy shows that, contrary to a common misunderstanding, people are not necessarily harmed by offensive speech or by having their feelings hurt. But because you harm yourself by speaking wrong speech, it's in your interest to be sure of your motivation and of the situation before using strong language or cutting humor with others. Oh, I just find this profoundly wise for myself. I don't, again, I'm a fangirl, so, a little biased here. This right here kind of surmises my entire teaching career. The areas where I was strong, the areas where I failed, the areas where I was a great teacher, and the areas where I caused harm to students. Miscalibrating tone, miscalibrating. Yeah, it's just a very different world that we live in now. I kind of came up, well, if you follow along, you know how I came up. I came up scrappy, and I moved all over, and I've never really taken roots anywhere. This is also why I was just so unhappy in academia. I just felt like I was in constant inner conflict with the policies that I was seeing rolled out in a larger kind of system scale. And I'm Buddhist, and what I perceived, it was harmful. It would be harmful downstream, and it's proving to be harmful downstream. And because I'm a scrappy fighter, I just got tired of fighting, and I was getting mean. I was getting mean as a junkyard dog, just like my daddy. Starting to see my daddy in me, and I love my daddy, and there's lots of my daddy I want in me, but that's not the part of my daddy I want in me. So again, as I said earlier, when you start to notice a pattern of behavior, just didn't feel like right livelihood for me anymore. I just wasn't a good fit. But I love this here. This is so hard. Right speech, oh my gosh, this may not be difficult for you. Maybe you're someone who is very easygoing, very soft-spoken. Maybe you have other kind of nervous system mechanisms than mine, so that you might be listening to me going, oh, I don't know what her deal is, man. I don't know why she has such a problem with this. Just meditate more. But maybe there's someone who's listening to this who really identifies with the level of fire that we're talking about here. This is just something that it's just a struggle. It's just a struggle to know how to talk to people anymore for me. So I find right now that what I find really helpful is to just kind of back off of all of it because of the missteps I seem to make by staying in situations that don't align. And I just need to watch people more. Watch people who are better at communicating and being in community, because I've never been in community, So this is very new for me, the idea of being in community. What I'll also say is that communities can very easily slip into tribalism. And I think this is the Buddhist point here, so I'm just going to go back and read this a little bit here. To explain his motivation for using displeasing words, he cites the analogy of a young boy who gets a sharp object in his mouth. You have to do everything you can to remove the object, even if it requires drawing blood. Otherwise, the boy will swallow the object and suffer even greater harm. I think sometimes, as a teacher, I saw this with other teachers, administrators. Not all, but I mean, I saw the behavior. I saw the behavior in some students. Because why? Because we're people. We see this behavior in people. Not all people, but some people. An avoidance of the hard things. An avoidance of drawing your daughter's blood to get the fucking glass out of her mouth. This is a feminine thing in particular that I see. My ladies, where are ya, ladies? I think women have been conditioned. We've been societally placated or forced into placation. There's been plenty of movies made about that, right? The hysterical woman that needs to be put down, whatever that might look like. But we're living in really weird times, and we're going to have to draw some blood here. And I think we're seeing a lot of blood being drawn. And if you're someone who's trying to avoid drawing blood, and again, this is where it gets so dicey for me, because this is, like, I could see someone like Trump taking what I'm saying right now and saying, that's why we're going to destroy the Iranian civilization. That's wholly unrelated to the sentiment behind this. And by the way, this sentiment here, I am not a Christian, and I have not been exposed to Christianity because I did not grow up in a religious home. But I'm certain that Christianity, I'm certain that any traditional wisdom tradition, whether it be a Western European, religion, or it be an ancient, I'm sure that all ancient wisdom traditions have some suggestions around to what degree do we avoid using displeasing words, and what are the downstream effects of avoiding using displeasing words, because it makes us uncomfortable, because we run the risk of not being liked, of being rejected by the group. I've always kind of been a rhino, and you can look that up yourself, what a rhinoceros is in Buddhism. There's plenty of people who disagree with my way, and that's okay. They have their life, their way, I have mine. But this is a tricky one, Boy, today, April 17th, 2026, I don't know anymore what this means exactly, other than that I just keep coming back to it. I do feel shame immediately, because I sense immediately when it was too much, wrong audience, wrong environment, and I don't know. So I'm just going to keep on reading. Idle chatter is defined as speaking out of season, what isn't based in fact, what isn't in accordance with the goal, the Dhamma, and the Vinaya, words that are not worth treasuring. Examples would include frivolous chatter and idle gossip. As the above example indicates, though, humorous speech does not come under idle chatter, as long as it serves a useful purpose. Human behavior can be so absurd that the best humor is often that which simply states the facts of the case. The canon contains enough examples of the Buddhist sense of humor in exposing human foibles to show that humor can be an effective tool on the path. I love that. I love that so much. I think I'll just, again, I'm not looking at the whole of the canon here, nor do I have experience with the whole of the canon. I can only speak to this from, my own practice and my own life, that I adore humor. If somebody were to ask me, hey, Sarah, what's the secret to a happy marriage? I've been married for not as long as some, but definitely in the double digits. And I would say humor is a huge part of it. And for me, what that means is not can you crack a joke. That to me is not how I. That's not quite how I. What I look for in relationship to humor in a friend or a mate, but more about, can I laugh at myself? Can I laugh with kindness? Can I? It's almost sort of a aw, aw, it's okay. It's almost like that. I also have to be very careful, though, to notice if I'm doing that to avoid something that I should be attending to. So, yeah, I think just as in everything, intentionality. Am I using humor to be sarcastic, to diminish someone else, to be cutting? I got to watch myself. What's the intention here, Sarah? Again, mindfulness, we haven't gotten to that yet, but it's one of the rights. It's there for a reason. The Vinaya contains no training rule against idle chatter, although its narratives contain a list of topics that would count as idle chatter among monks. A list that is also found in the suttas, Sutta 173. The list is interesting in covering everything from village gossip to topics that are currently studied in academic philosophy and science, such as speculations on the origin of the cosmos. Most of the list, though, is composed of topics such as politics, battles, women, heroes, food, and places that provide the standard fodder for the public media. I think I could talk about this forever and ever and ever and ever. And I think that again, if you're familiar with Buddhism or you've been following along in this reading and the book, then we've talked about Six Sense Media, right? Go back and you look in earlier sections of the book, Six Sense Media. Once again, we're getting into Six Sense Media. And we're getting into topics that 2,600 years ago in Buddhist time, Buddha recognized these topics could plant a seed that could easily blossom into disagreement, hatred, tribalism, fixed views, othering. And so although there was an explicit rule against it, he suggested that these topics were idle chatter. Think about how the world works today. Think about how social media works today. Now think about this. Yeah. In light of the fact that right speech should be timely, Sutta 139 provides a particularly interesting example of applying the Dhamma in an untimely way. Venerable Udayan tries to use the perception that all feelings are stressful to argue, in response to a question on the consequences of action, that all action results in stress. The Buddha, however, rebukes him for applying the wrong teaching to the question, showing that this type of speech also counts as idle chatter. This principle would then apply to any discussion of a point of Dhamma that is not appropriate to the question asked or the person asking it. I'm going to need a little help with this one because I don't feel confident that I really understand exactly what he's getting at here. So I'm going to go do a little bit of robot help. But remember, robot's robot. And then I'll be back to let you know what robot had to say. I'll be right back. Oh, this is so great. So I'll share with you here what robot had to say. And yeah. Yay, I'm glad I understood it more than I realized I did. This is great. So here's what Robot had to say about this particular example. So Robot begins with what Udayan did wrong. So he used a true teaching, true only meaning what the Buddha taught, not true like it's true for all. He took a teaching that, yes, the Buddha did teach. All feelings are stressful in the sense of dukkha, in the sense of there is innate suffering. Yes, you could sort of make that claim, but herein lies the problem. He's applying it to a different question. What are the consequences of action? And so he's kind of making a categorical error here, which we humans are wont to do, right? He's kind of suggesting that all action leads to stress. Therefore, all action leads to stress. Category error 101. All feelings are dukkha. All actions lead to stress. So kind of collapsing everything together. And so in doing so, he's kind of misleading, right? He's not applying the teachings correctly. In so much so that he's actually wholly teaching the wrong thing. In relationship to Buddha, he's misrepresenting what the Buddha taught. Probably not knowingly, right? He's not knowingly doing it. But he's misrepresenting Buddha's teachings. Because his categorical error suggests that there's no meaningful distinction between skillful and unskillful actions. And that's problematic, isn't it? Given that the entire Eightfold Path structure requires skillful action, reducing suffering. So I guess you could say, if you really wanted to get precise, given Buddha's own Vedayas, this would be wrong view, so misunderstanding the teaching entirely, which would lead himself and anybody who's teaching to a completely false conclusion within the Buddhist framework. And it's also wrong speech because it's not really addressing the question itself. So wrong view plus misapplied speech equals idle chatter. So this is kind of how Robot helped me to understand it. Fascinating, right? Really fascinating stuff. So who knows? Maybe I'm guilty of this right now, and that's why I'll repeat again and again and again and again. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a nun. I've never been ordained. I have virtually no exposure to the Pāli Canon because I don't speak Pāli, and I don't know how to translate Pāli. So don't use me, okay? Yeah, I know I've repeated that, and this seems like a good place to do that again. And it looks like we're coming up at the top of the hour here. So I think this will be my last section that I read and comment on. And then I'll wrap it up for us. Keep us on time. AN 10:165, in addition to listing forms of wrong speech to be avoided, also lists corresponding forms of right speech to be developed. Above and beyond avoiding lies, for example, one should be one who holds to the truth, is firm, reliable, no deceiver of the world. Beyond avoiding divisive speech, one should reconcile those who have broken apart, or cement those who are united. Love concord, delight in concord, enjoy concord, speak things that create concord. In addition to avoiding harsh speech, one should speak words that are soothing to the ear, that are affectionate, that go to the heart, that are polite, appealing, and pleasing to people at large. In addition to avoiding idle chatter, one should speak words worth treasuring, timely, reasonable, circumscribed, connected with the goal. In this way, right speech is not just a matter of avoiding harmful speech, but is also a matter of engaging in speech that gives benefit all around. This is a great place for me to leave it, because number one, it's the very last section before we get into right action. And number two, again, this is the albatross. This is the albatross, the thing that is my sharpest kind of character, personality trait, whatever you want to call it. I realize, yes, there's no self, there is a self, blah, 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 blah. Go back and just listen to the whole thing if you want to know my whole thoughts and all of that stuff. But yeah, this is it for me. This is it. This idea of, we should be developing. We should be developing. Yeah, for the past couple of years, I've been struggling with this very much and have a lot of work to do, and if you do decide to look up the rhinoceros in Buddhism, and I wasn't always a rhinoceros, by the way. I've been in many sanghas throughout the years. As I say, I've moved all over, so, I've been to many different kinds of experiences depending on where I was living that year. But this, this is where I do want a teacher, because I see how I am, I guess by Buddha's definition, I'm caught in a negative feedback loop in relationship to this idea here. One that causes me harm and one that causes others harm. So, if you hear me, you'll hear me talking about, I haven't found a sangha and we're trying to move and I don't want to get settled in, and because I know myself and I don't want to do that to myself. But I'm really looking forward to getting a teacher, someone who I trust, someone who I pick because I respect. And in the 12-step program, if you're familiar with it, by the way, I haven't been in 12 steps for a couple of years, just because, I was in it for 22 years and I think the program saved my life, that particular program, a couple of them. But I'm just doing something else now. But there's a great saying in there, when you're looking for a sponsor, it's not a teacher, it's more of like a mentor, if you will. You find someone who has what you want. And so I look forward to finding a teacher who has what I want. So what that would mean for me is someone who's had a crazy, crazy fucked up life and lots of trauma, and who is I can observe them and see that they've really been able to work with their mind in manifest ways that I can see. And then I know, dang, I've been working on that. It's not a project because we don't want to cling to projects around here, right? But, it's a pain point. It's a pain point. This just feels like the perfect place to leave it. Developing right speech, words that are soothing to the ear. I cuss like a sailor. I get angry. I get So I'm seeing, as I'm reading this, I'm seeing so clearly the negative feedback loop that I've been in and how I recreate conditions. And this goes back to what I said earlier. And again, I realize everybody's going to have all different kinds of opinions about this. Buddhists from different, Buddhist communities have different approaches to this. Again, I told you that I'm Theravāda, so rhinos are pretty common in the Theravāda tradition. So anytime I start to see that using soothing words, if I find it difficult for me to be polite, difficult for me to appeal and be pleasing to people at large, I need to remove myself from that situation. Yeah, I need to remove myself from that situation so that I can. And that doesn't necessarily even always mean that I remove myself from the situation. And this is something that I actually, this is probably the heart and soul of my work as an embodiment coach. If somebody were to say, hey, if you could synthesize what your kind of philosophy is as a coach working with the body in relationship to thoughts arising, then it would be this idea right here. I immediately need to turn my attention inward when I notice it arising and do a million different micro adjustments that I've taught myself, picked up here and there to remind myself that I'm not in danger. I'm safe. Nothing's going on here. And if I repeatedly find that feeling arising in any kind of situation, I use that as information to get the fuck out, not just for my sake, but for your sake. Anybody who knows me, it's for all our sake that I do that. I find it so interesting that, anyway, I don't want to go down my feelings about what the West thinks wellness looks like, but yeah, I'll just leave that there. That right speech, as we leave right speech for the next reading and move into right action, because from right speech we can move into right action. I think it's why I'm so glad we're on, we got to spend a little bit of time with right speech and just kind of the nuts and bolts of the Vinaya, Buddha's rules and Buddha's suggestions and, what they mean to my understanding with the help of robot. Remember, I'm an idiot, don't trust me. And I see that when I am in alignment, that it's very easy for me. It's very easy for me to let that love just spill out because I feel it. I feel it all the time. And I bet you that's how a lot of us operate, right? I mean, unless you're a psychopath or a sociopath, there might be many, well, no, there's not, I don't really know how many people listen to this, but it's probably under 2 digits. But if you are listening to this for whatever reason, if we're not engaging in this right speech, it's probably because we're unregulated. Maybe we've lost, maybe we're in an environment where we're finding it really difficult to co-regulate. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe it's a trauma response, which often it is for me, or was for me. Nowadays, there's always going to be a bit of that going on, but I don't know. Maybe not. What do I know? I don't know. Okay, but here's what I do know. A lot of times when I lose my mindfulness, and it's on me, by the way. I'm not saying that the outside conditions made me lose my mindfulness. I'm saying when I've lost my mindfulness, it's oftentimes because I'm coming up against something that doesn't align with my values. And it's not that I'm judging. And again, this is very dicey. This is very slippery because of course I'm judging, right? Implicit in what I just said is judgment. But is judgment really so bad, right? I judge Epstein. I wish the world, would also judge him a little more. That'd be great. Maybe we could change the behavior downstream someday. So it's not an us against them. It's nothing like that. It's just more about, wow, why am I staying in a situation that brings out the worst in me? It's not the situation that's wrong. I'm not in alignment, and from that place, now I'm going to move it from Buddhism over to Al-Anon, the real backbone of Al-Anon. Now we're getting into family systems, which Al-Anon really is all about, Why do I stay in misaligned places? That's not fair to me, and it's not fair to those people. who don't deserve to be hanging out with someone who's misaligned and behaving accordingly? So I think these are all questions that we can ask ourselves all the time. But I'm absolutely grateful and thrilled to have gotten to spend a few pages of this book talking about the biggest albatross for me in this life, which is right speech. Very grateful to you, Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu, again, for putting this book in the Creative Commons and making it free and available to the world in many, many languages. It's time for me to wrap it up, but thank you so much for listening, if you've been listening, and hope you were able to get something out of this that you find interesting or valuable. Take really good care of yourself. I promise I won't let 3 weeks go by again before I drop another episode. Be well.